We've all heard that cliched maxim to keep it simple, right? I actually love this advice, but I've discovered over the years working as a colorist that keeping it simple is usually anything but. Why is this? It's because for filmmakers, simplified thinking and methodology are never handed to us ready-made. Simplification is itself a creative act. We use our taste and our knowledge and our experience not to keep it simple, but to make it simple, which is what we're going to be discussing in my next few videos. And today we're going to kick things off by talking about a simplified approach to the way we deal with contrast. Let's dive right into it. So let's talk about some ways we can simplify our thinking and our technique when it comes to working with contrast in our images. Let's say I've just landed on this image here and I need to grade it up. How do I know where to begin? How do I know which tools to use? How do I know which tools to combine? How do I know which tools to avoid? I'm going to walk you through a simple approach to these questions that works great regardless of the material that you're grading. And the first step in that approach is to ask a simple question. Do I actually need to start adjusting my contrast via whatever tools I'm going to, lift, gamma, gain, contrast, pivot, curves, whatever the case may be, or do I simply need to adjust the exposure of my image? Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go over to this second clip here where I've got a ramp prepared, and I'm going to flip my histogram over to a waveform so that we can see a visual representation of the linear journey from pure black to pure white, like so. Now, I want to show you the simplest possible operation that we can perform on any image. That is an offset operation. An offset operation moves the entire signal uniformly up or down. And let's watch what happens when I turn this wheel to the right. We're going to see our entire signal, the very bottom, the very top, and everything in between uniformly move up in sync, like so. And if I drop it down, we're going to see it drop down in the opposite direction, like so. Simplest possible operation we can perform on an image. And when we are in a proper scene-referred color-managed workflow like I am now, this offset wheel also approximates exposure, the same kind of exposure adjustment that you would get by moving the iris on your lens. So when I say, do I need to adjust contrast, or is this a simple question of exposure? What I'm really asking is, do I need to start with offset, or should I dive into the more nuanced adjustments of lift, gamma, gain, contrast, pivot, or curves? So let's look at the way that I would have tackled this in my first few years working as a colorist. I would have gone into my meat and potatoes here, my lift, gamma, and gain, and started turning knobs and started trying to make the image look better than what it came in at. And there's nothing fundamentally wrong with this, and I would be able to get it to a decent spot probably pretty quickly. But if I ask that first question, is this an exposure or a contrast issue, I can get just as good, probably a better result with a single simple adjustment here on my offset, just by adjusting the exposure. So if I move this over to the right, you're going to see I'm in just as good of a place as I was over here, and to my eye, probably a little bit better. So that's question number one. Do I need to dive into contrast? Is it time to dive into those tools, or do I need to start by sweetening my exposure, by opening up a quarter stop or dropping a half a stop, or whatever the case may be? Now let's move on and say that we've set our exposure, or it's come in correctly, and we do indeed now need to start concerning ourselves with more individualized tonal adjustments of lift, gamma, gain, contrast, pivot, or our curves. And we're going to take a look at the way each of these tools manipulates our signal and the way they relate to one another so that we can clear up and simplify our thinking about them a little bit. So let's go back over to our ramp for a moment, and let's start with our lift, gamma, and gain. I'm going to go over to my gain here, and I want you to look and see what happens on my waveform when I drop my gain down. You're going to see that my topmost white point, my brightest white, is being dropped down, like so. If I go up, it's going to be moving clear out through the roof of my waveform, like so. If I go over to my lift, we're going to see the same behavior on the bottom of the image. I can move the deepest shadow portion of my image upward, or I can drop it further downward, like so. Finally, if I go to my gamma, I'm going to see everything in between those 2 points either bow upwards or downwards. So that's lift, gamma, gain. Now I want to move on and look at the way that contrast pivot relates to those same adjustments. So let's watch what happens on this waveform ramp when I dial contrast in, like so. What's going on? All I'm doing is adjusting lift and gain simultaneously. And what's more, I can adjust the ratio, the amount of effect that I'm having on the lift versus on the gain by moving my pivot around here. So let's look what happens if I move my pivot all the way to 0. I now have turned this contrast knob effectively into a gain wheel. I'm getting the exact same behavior out of this contrast knob that I would be getting by adjusting my gain wheel up here. Anyone want to guess what's going to happen when I move my pivot up here to 1? That's right, my contrast knob has now effectively become a lift adjustment. It's making the exact same manipulation of my signal that I would be getting with my lift wheel over here. So that's lift, gamma, gain, contrast pivot, and the way that they interrelate. Let's now go over to our custom curves, the other main way of affecting tonal contrast in DaVinci Resolve, and look at the way that relates to these first two tools. So first things first, you're going to notice that the graph we have over here is very similar to the one we have represented here in our waveform. And you'll notice as I start to draw control points that whatever I do here is going to be mirrored here in the waveform. So let's start with the basics. If I grab this upper right control point and I drop it down, what am I doing to the image? That's right, I'm dropping the gain. That's the exact same manipulation that I would be getting if I were to go over and drop my gain wheel here. I'm just doing it in a different way. What happens if I move upward and to the left? Same thing, I'm increasing my gain in the exact same way that I would be if I adjusted there in my primaries. Let's look at the leftmost control point now. Same thing. What's going on here? That's my lift being adjusted in the same way, just using a different tool. What happens if I go downward and to the right? Same thing, I'm dropping my lift. So far I haven't seen anything that I can't do with my lift, gamma, gain or my contrast pivot, but the fun thing about our custom curves is we can do a bit more because we can draw control points wherever we want to, as many of them as we want to, and get really, really nuanced and specific with the way we're affecting particular tonal regions of our image. That's awesome, but with great power comes great responsibility, and we've got to make sure that we're actually serving our image and not breaking anything or making it look weird. So just as an obvious example, let's paste that grade onto the image. I've completely broken and solarized it and turned it into a bizarre looking frame. So the custom curves have great power, but you got to be careful when you're using them that you're making good quality adjustments that aren't breaking or tearing or having any kind of adverse effect on the image. So that's a review of these three primary tools in Resolve for manipulating contrast, which all fundamentally are doing variations on the same manipulation. They're just offering different knobs, different interfaces, and different ways of conceiving of those manipulations. So my advice is to pick one and stick with it. I've been a contrast pivot person for a long time. That's where I've got my miles logged. So I'm very comfortable with the way those knobs feel in my hands, and I can get my image where I want it to go very quickly. I also know what contrast pivot does in comparison to using lift, gamma, gain or my custom curves. So I'm never tempted to start and make a little bit of adjustment here and then flip over and make more adjustments in my lift, gamma, gain, and then a few more in my custom curves, because I know that I'm really making the same adjustments. I'm just spreading it out and making it more difficult for myself conceptually and making a more complicated grade that's really not necessary. So pick a tool, stick with it, and learn the properties that we just reviewed today in terms of what these tools are actually doing under the hood. Because at the end of the day, it's all very simple math. It's all very simple fundamentals. Resolve and any other grading platform are just offering you some different knobs, different interfaces, and different ways of thinking about these same basic adjustments that we're always going to want to make on our images. I hope this gives you some fresh ideas on how to think about, communicate, and implement your vision when you're grading. Distilling our creative approach down to its essentials is rarely simple, and it's never really finished, but it can be a hell of a lot of fun. We're going to continue this conversation in my next video, where we'll talk about simplifying our approach to colorimetry. We'll see you then.